Hello everyone. On this opportunity, we're going to talk with the British historian Niall Ferguson, author of great books such as Colossus, Civilization, The Square and the Tower, and more recently, Doom, which has reached the Chilean bookstores in the Spanish version under the name of Desastre, Historia y Política de las Catastrophes. Thanks, Niall, for this opportunity. And I start by asking you why you decided to write about a disaster in progress. I mean, the COVID-19 is still going on now with the Omicron variant.
Well, thank you, Juan. Of course, a number of reviewers said, why didn't he wait until COVID-19 was over? I'd still be waiting. And in fact, I could be waiting a year from now. It's the wrong way to think about the book, which is not a history of COVID-19. It's a history of disasters. And in many ways, all of history is a catalogue of disasters. We write about plagues, we write about wars, we write about revolutions. Sometimes we write about other natural disasters, great floods, great fires, great volcanic eruptions. And it occurred to me early on in the pandemic, when it was clear that very few people had any sense of historical perspective, that no book existed that brought together all the different kinds of disaster between one set of covers. So that's what Doom is, and it doesn't need COVID to be over to be worth reading. In fact, we'll get COVID over quicker if we really learn some lessons from history. One of the reasons the policy response has been so bad over the last 2 years is precisely that the people making the decisions did not know enough history.
Excellent. Despite all the technological advances and the experience accumulated over the years and decades and centuries, it's surprising that you say that we should not waste time to trying to forecast catastrophes. Why?
Well, they're inherently unpredictable. That's a key point. Of course, I could give a TED talk every year for the next 10 years, predicting the next pandemic, and I might get it right. I could also give the TED talk every year predicting the next financial crisis, and at some point I'd be right. But if you look at the incidence of disasters in history, the really big ones that kill a lot of people, there's really no rhythm, there's no predictable cycle going on, because most forms of disaster are not normally distributed in any predictable way. They're either random, that's certainly true of major wars, there's no pattern there, or they're governed by something called a power law. Now, power law, in the case of, say, earthquakes, a subject that Chileans understand well, tells you where earthquakes are likely to happen. That much we know from geography, but it doesn't tell you when, and it doesn't tell you how big. All we know is that at some point, to take where I live, at some point in California, there'll be a really big earthquake. But we just don't know when, and we don't know how big. So you could waste an awful lot of time trying to guess the timing of the next big earthquake in Chile or California. The truth is, you're not going to get it right except by luck.
In this sense, one aspect where I think Doom connects with your past books has to do with institutions, especially the call to build strong institutions. In your opinion, what characteristics should resilient institutions must have these days?
Well, it's clear that the institutions that were supposed to deal with the public health emergency in the United States were very overrated, because in 2019, a global survey, which was done by Johns Hopkins and the Economist Intelligence Unit, said that the United States was the country best prepared for a pandemic in the world. In reality, as we all know, the United States has done really quite badly. Not the worst. There are countries such as Peru, for example, and some Eastern European countries with higher excess mortality in relative terms. But the US has done much, much worse than anybody would have predicted prior to COVID-19. And I think that's because the public health bureaucracy, whose job this is, has deteriorated. It's become bloated, inefficient, bureaucratic. And this is a pattern that I think one can see in other domains as well. Things look as if they work, but in fact they suffer from a kind of institutional sclerosis. Think of bank regulation in 2007. There was a lot of it on paper. There were all kinds of national and international rules governing bank capital adequacy. It's just that none of those rules actually worked in a financial crisis. So one of the key arguments that I make in Doom is that we mustn't be taken in by the appearance of preparedness, of disaster readiness. In reality, bureaucracies are quite good at giving the appearance of being prepared without actually being prepared. If you compare how the public health authorities in the US or the UK performed with their counterparts in Taiwan and South Korea, you can see that there were efficient institutions in East Asia that responded really quickly and effectively to the pandemic. And we therefore need to understand why most Western public health agencies failed to do that. The broad lesson is that over time institutions will tend to deteriorate. There's a kind of entropy in administration. Unless you're renewing, stress testing, and pressing bureaucracies to be more efficient at their jobs, they will get worse over time.
Also, among the disasters caused by human beings, you mentioned wars. In the book, you say that today we don't prepare for wars because we think they are not going to happen. But how do you see the situation between Russia and Ukraine? Because there's a lot of attention and tensions with this issue.
Part of the problem is that we've forgotten what a really big war looks like. In truth, the wars that the United States fought in Afghanistan and in Iraq were quite small in terms of the scale of operations and the casualties that were sustained. You have to go a long way back to come across a really big war. Now, what is brewing on the Ukrainian-Russian frontier is potentially quite a big war, though I suspect that President Putin intends for it to be quite a short war. But it's easy enough to start a war. Sometimes it's hard to stop it. And so who knows just on what scale this will actually play out. It's also possible that he may decide to back away, having achieved significant diplomatic results, which he may be satisfied with. He's driven a wedge between the United States and its European allies, for example. He's exposed the vulnerability of Europe to Russian natural gas. So it may not happen. But right now, I'm pretty sure he wants to take some military action. And that's going to be, I think, quite shocking to many Europeans and Americans because of the scale of the Russian military effort. There is a lot of armor on the Ukrainian-Russian frontier. The Russians are also capable of waging cyber warfare, naval warfare, air warfare. And so this could be really quite a big operation, bigger than what we saw in 2014. I try to argue in Doom and Disastre that we shouldn't draw a distinction between natural and man-made disasters as if there's something profoundly different between, say, a pandemic and a war. In reality, what leads to excess mortality is nearly always human decision-making. And just as we haven't prepared well or hadn't prepared well for a pandemic, it turned out, I don't think we've prepared well for Russian aggression. And threatening financial sanctions, which is what the United States is currently doing, is not going to deter Putin. The only thing that would deter him would be sufficient military firepower on the other side of the border that would actually inflict serious costs on the Russian military. So I think it's actually quite a similar story, the story of the pandemic and the coming war.
And how is your evaluation about the response of the West to this crisis? Because we can see very different positions between the UK sending anti-tank weapons or the Germans trying to not to get involved, and the Americans trying to talk with the Russians and drawing red lines, and Brussels seems sometimes is watching this as an spectator.
I think that it's normal in a crisis like this for the different nations to have somewhat different approaches. It would be remarkable if there were complete unity within the NATO alliance when the problem of Ukraine has for so long been controversial. We made a promise that Ukraine had some possibility of joining NATO at some unspecified future date. The Russians want us to take that off the table, but that's not all. The Russians also want, in effect, to render NATO enlargement since the Cold War null and void by saying that no military action, no exercises, no US military assets can be stationed on former Warsaw Pact or Soviet Union member states. And that's quite a significant number of NATO members. I don't think there's any possibility of NATO agreeing to that. So when it comes to the broader Russian demands, there's unity. But when it comes to what exactly do we do about Ukraine, I don't think there is so much unity. The United States clearly does not want to commit military assets to the defense of Ukraine. What it could have done, what the Biden administration failed to do, was to build up Ukraine's own military capability. That was something that actually happened under the Trump administration, despite all the controversies about NATO and about Ukraine. I think the Biden administration has dropped the ball and has reverted to the old Obama playbook that sanctions will work, whereas the Europeans are rather scared of really tough sanctions in case the Russians retaliate by cutting off the natural gas on which Europe has become so dependent. So I don't find it surprising that the Germans are pursuing a different course from, say, the United States or the United Kingdom, which no longer needs to pay any attention to the Germans now that it's outside the EU. The key question is, can Putin exploit these divisions so that he makes a military move with relatively low costs? And that's what I'm not so sure about. I think the minute there are armored vehicles crossing into Ukraine, the minute there is actual war, there'll be a great deal more unity on the NATO side than we're currently seeing in the diplomatic phase.
And what about the role of China in this crisis? Could be the winner, the real winner of this crisis, because China could offer a mediation, some kind of diplomatic summit in order to de-escalate this crisis, but it's silent about it.
Well, from a Chinese point of view, nothing would be more delightful than for the United States and its Western European allies to get stuck in a war with Russia. Russia and China are much closer right now than they've tended to be historically. It's a little bit like in the early Cold War, except that then the Soviet Union was the senior partner and China was the junior partner. Now the roles are reversed. So from China's point of view, it can sit quietly, say as little as possible, and leave this crisis to play out, knowing that it benefits pretty much whatever happens. I think the bigger question is at what point that Russian-Chinese relationship begins to fray, because ultimately, no matter how much Putin achieves at the western side of Russia's territory, he is increasingly vulnerable to the rise of China at the eastern end of Russian territory, as well as when it comes to Central Asia, which has traditionally been Russia's backyard, but where China is an increasingly influential player. So although right now it probably does suit Xi Jinping to have this all happening, takes the Americans' minds off Taiwan, for example, in the long run, I think the real question is that Russia-Chinese relationship and at what point it begins to break down, because it can't last indefinitely. In a way, it's anomalous for Russia and China to be so closely allied as they are today.
And finally, between this global democratic retreat or backsliding and the climate change, which of these two disasters of catastrophes is for you more important right now?
Well, in some ways, Juan, they're interrelated. It's the democracies of the world that are doing the most to address the problem of climate change. It's in Europe and North America where carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions have been reduced, it's in the undemocratic East, in China in particular, where the problem of climate change is being made worse. 2/3 of the increase in carbon dioxide emissions since Greta Thunberg was born back in 2003 are due to China, and more than 80% of the increase in coal consumption. So I think there are two really important points to make. The first is that if democracies, especially European democracies, pursue policies that are aimed at reducing emissions by increasing the role of renewables in the energy mix, I'm talking here principally about wind and solar, the cost of energy is going to go up in Europe. It's already gone up significantly, partly because of unrelated factors, but it's going to go up because that's a goal of policy, to raise the price of carbon. And I think the backlash against greenflation, against higher energy prices, is going to make the Gilets jaunes protest of some years ago against President Macron look like a teddy bear's picnic. So European, in particular European governments, but also North American governments, have to beware that their green energy policies could become very unpopular if what they mean is higher prices for heating and electricity. The second point I'll make is that China has for years talked the talk about green energy without walking the walk. There has to be sustained pressure on China to reduce its coal consumption, to meaningfully accelerate its transition to cleaner energy. Otherwise, all the efforts of the Western world will be futile because, in fact, emissions will continue to increase, and that will mean higher global temperatures, and that will mean significant climate problems around the world. So those seem to me the key problems. I'm seeing some signs of realism since the Glasgow conference, COP26 last year, but it's not moving nearly fast enough.
Excellent. Finally, we want to recommend your book. It's a good summer reading here in Chile, Desastre, en sus librerías. And we'd like to say thanks again, Niall, for this great interview and this opportunity to talk about disasters, wars, pandemics. And we hope to see you soon in Chile again.
I look forward to it too. And let me reassure viewers, it's not as dismal or depressing a book as you might think, because there are aspects of the history of disaster that are, in a strange kind of way, funny. So I want to reassure you, you can take this book to the beach, although you will keep checking for tsunamis while you're reading it.
Well, we know a lot about disasters here in China, and this happens from time to time. So thanks, Niall.
Thanks. Great to see you.
Bye.